All right, we're on air. So, yeah. Want to start with some announcements, right? And then we'll do a few questions. And yeah, Nate, do you want to kick it off with path queries?
Yeah, sure. We can explain this a little bit more after we run through everything, but Artur had noticed that the chat example was broken by my refactor of some stuff in the queries logic. And specifically, it uses this feature of Racer that's not as widely used called path queries. And basically, they weren't reinitializing correctly. So his pull request is actually pretty much correct. I just ran through it, so I'll be merging that in shortly. But the basic gist is that path queries are this feature where you can have a query that automatically adds new documents as they match a list of IDs, and that lets you effectively do a real-time join. So that the pull request just fixed an initialization problem with it. So I'll merge that in soon. We should talk a little bit more about that more like in the questions section.
Sounds good. And then Pavel, you had you wanted to show your transitional router. Is that right? Oh, you're muted still.
Couple of minutes.
Couple of things. All right.
From now.
Oh, you want a couple minutes before you share your screen?
Yeah, like I didn't actually. I'm publishing currently.
Okay, cool.
Oh, live publishing. Sweet. All right. So there was on the mailing list, I guess I just wanted to kind of go over. There's been a few threads where people are making new components, new collections of components. I saw, I think it's Sergey released something called decomp palette, and in the chat real quick, and I'll put it in the blog post later in the notes. That looks to be like a collection of components based on some new Bootstrap stuff. And Russell, I believe, been putting together a component awesome Derby list. I guess awesome is this like meme where you just list a bunch of things that are good to use for some project, or not quite sure, but it's pretty cool because it made basically a GitHub README with a list of a bunch of components and projects that are useful. So I'm going to be trying to go through that list and adding them to the components example repo, or encouraging the authors to make an example that is compatible with our repo. So that'd be pretty cool. And another thing Artur released, and I think Pavel, you mentioned last week, was the server-side queries. So I put that link in chat. It'll be in the blog post too. And this is the thing about where you don't want to let the client define the queries that get run on the server. So I think it's a module that makes that pattern where the client can say, I want to run this query. The server will say, I'm going to run the query that I want to run. Right? And yeah, so that's pretty cool. Check that out. Yeah. Other announcements? I guess now we'll see the live published proofs.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Cool. So I guess in terms of questions, maybe I'll start with explaining what path queries are. Then Ian, you can prep the rest of the questions. So anyway, path queries is this feature in Racer where you can call model.query and then a collection, and then typically you pass it in object, where that object is turned into like a Mongo query or whatever your native query is, and this new server, side query generator was added to kind of translate some other format into a Mongo query. But there's another form of queries that Racer supports by default called path queries, and if you make the second argument a string, Racer will assume that's a path. So basically, it will look at that path to get an ID or a list of IDs, sort of like it does with refs, where it'll like look up somewhere else to get the thing that you're referencing, and then it will just basically create a live query to whatever IDs are added or removed from that. So this is in the chat example, is where this is used. There's a model function that generates a list of IDs, which are all of the users associated with all of the messages. And that way, if a new user gets created just because like a new person joins, adds a new message, then the list of users will automatically get updated for that particular room. And everybody in the room will be subscribed to that user automatically. So it's a pretty cool thing. It basically lets you do joins in real time. We don't actually use it that much, so I think that maybe because it's a little bit more complicated to use than would be ideal, and also because it's not as like commonly, we haven't really talked about it that much. But the idea is basically to help you like do real-time joins. I would not be surprised if there's some bugs with it because we don't use it as much, as evidenced by this. But it's kind of a cool thing and is good for like if you have two different collections where you want to subscribe to some subset of one collection based on documents in another one.
Cool. I think another thing we could talk about is the pull request that Pavel is working on to Derby Stylus. So he and Artur have figured out how to basically load styles from in a component's copy or JavaScript file, right? So that you don't have to load the styles in from like your main app for that component, right? So it basically means that you can specify the styles in one place, and
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, and I think along with that, you're switching to, what is it, auto prefixer?
Yes, it's called after prefixer. Yeah, instead of nib library, which kind of was used mainly to have those prefixes, but later on this after prefixer project appeared, and most of newly created projects, they use this after prefixer to prefix your style sheets automatically, and it dynamically gets the data from the Can I Use website, and you can specify what browsers you want to support. If you don't want, for example, Explorer 8, you can specify like IE9 plus, and it's only going to prefix those stuff which is needed for more modern browsers.
Cool.
Yeah, that's cool. I think we should actually build it as its own Derby plugin. I was just thinking about this because you might, especially with people defining components, have some people use Stylus and some people might use less and some people might use CSS native. And so what we probably want to do is like let people use whatever and then at the end prefix everything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it makes sense. So we thought about some kind of piping stuff like this build tool Gulp does to integrate somehow Gulp into the Derby core, but we haven't found a good solution for this yet.
Got it. I mean, it doesn't have to be anything too fancy. It could just be like a, I don't know, simple like list of functions that get called or something.
Mm-hmm.
So we can just build that into specifically like the CSS processor part of it, and we'll just basically start creating middleware hooks probably.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably the easiest way to do it.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be complicated. And yeah, I just think being tied to the stylus thing is kind of unnecessary. Like we could definitely break it out.
Yeah, we just need to find a way to pipe this stuff from like through some kind of a asset pipeline chain.
Yeah. Okay, that should be doable. Take a note of that.
Yeah. Okay, so actually I have just published the Derby transitioner. You can look at the code at the weird way I have overridden your code. I'm currently working on a simple demonstration for it.
Cool.
It's gonna be, I'm going to do it in like 3 minutes or so.
Sure. Were there any other questions that came up, Ian? Why don't we?
I have had
Or you had a couple
question.
too, Pavel.
Yes, I have a question about. So there are. Let me remember it. There are a couple of. As we found out, there is a hidden, undocumented way to specify an as keyword, an as argument, and if you do it like as body, oh, not page dot something, then this component is accessible page wide. Right, and you have like inside of a component you can access at page, and you can get any component that you have specified in your views via as equal something, like page dot something.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So another thing is, so we can specify particular methods that we want to run from another component, but is there an easy way, a convenient way to do the same thing and access the local model of a particular component globally in a view of another component?
Yeah, I mean, so it was specifically a goal to make it relatively easy to, like, in templates, traverse the other components. So it does require a little bit of like coordination. So there's a couple different ways that we've done it in our app. As you mentioned, putting it on the page is one good way. I should note that you can both put things on the app or on the page. The app is an object which never gets recreated, so it's just like persistent forever in a given browser session. And the page is recreated if you ever do a full client-side render. It creates a new page. So generally we use the page because you will have less memory leak potential because you're creating a new page every time, and assuming everything gets cleaned up, hopefully that will be okay. If you put it on the app, like, you might bleed across states, which you don't want to do. So yeah, generally we use the page. We use it in a couple cases. Like, we have like a modal component that we actually reference from the page, and it's a pretty useful pattern. So that's definitely one way to do it, is like page dot thing, and then you can access the page dot like modal, for example, dot model straight up, which is just a reference on the component. So it's just available. All it does is a property lookup. It's nothing fancy. But the thing that, in general, I kind of wrestled with exactly how to do this, like whether or not to support instance methods of objects in the model is kind of a tricky thing. Ultimately decided to keep it simple and make it, at least for now, so that when you call a function, it assumes that it's coming out of the controller, and when you access data, it assumes it's coming out of the model. But then there's sort of like the model can be touched by like saying control, like the controller, so like component.model, And then in the model, there's actually a reference in a component to the given controller. So the like component dot dollar sign, or if you're in a thing that's like data, so if you're just getting a value and rendering it, you can use the dollar sign controller, which is a reference to the component you're in, dot model or something like that. So like this is useful because if you're like if you're calling a function in another component, you might want to pass a reference to this component. So you could like, for example, pass in the dollar sign controller. If that makes any sense. So there's basically links between the controller and the model in like both ways. And the context of, or like the namespacing of like data stuff is in the model, and the namespacing of like function calls is in the controller. So like, do you have like a specific example that might make this a little more clear?
Well, yeah. So for example, there is like well, I'm going to be talking about like based on our application we do. So we have like a list, a table with like players of a game. We have also a chart. So those are two separate components. And we need a third component which can filter stuff for those two components. So this filtering component should have access to the local modal data of those two table and a chart components to filter stuff over there.
So if you're doing that, I actually don't recommend using the properties of them to like connect the data, because really like what you're trying to do is bind data, right? So to bind data, well, there's two ways to go about it. One is to say like look up where I am and then find the other thing and then grab its model and then use paths over there. So you could do that. The hard thing though is that if you want those things to be real-time bound, Derby doesn't like. So Derby is just like mostly giving you references to other things for the purpose of like when you click a button, connecting functionality to another thing. But Racer is the thing that actually sort of like propagates data around. So it's not really aware of all this stuff. It really is only aware of stuff in the model. And so you kind of need to make like an explicit connection between two different things in the model in order for the events to propagate correctly. So like you could render it initially by like getting an object reference to something and then grabbing its model and then like rendering it out. But there's no way for those model events to propagate because like there's no connection really. So that's what like refs are for in Racer, is that they basically, when something changes, figure out what else is referencing that thing and then update it in those places too. But like Derby doesn't really do that. Derby is mostly just a thing that connects events to interactions, like we'll do stuff. But it's not like propagating data around. So in general, when you want to like propagate data around, you need to use Racer. Derby makes it easier by letting you like say like this attribute of a component equals, and then you can say like curly braces and give it a path, and then what that really does is it creates like a model ref. So what you're doing is you're saying when this thing changes, update it in this other place, and vice versa. And so the best way to propagate data between two components that are like siblings is to say like whatever data equals, and then give it some sort of model name inside of that inside of where you are now, and then the attribute is like the name inside of the component, and then the same for the other one. So you sort of like connect them together in the parent space, and that is the best way to do that. Alternatively, if you're what you're trying to do is like when someone like does something like clicks a button, then the best thing to use is actually usually events, because events are the best way to kind of say, if this thing happens and other things might care about it, then other things can choose to respond to it. But events are bad if what you want to happen is like for one thing to very explicitly do something else once, because events are like one to many or zero to many times this thing will happen. So if what you want to happen is you want something else to deterministically happen once, you want to call a method. So there's basically like these three different kind of ways to communicate depending on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to like propagate data that you want to all be the same data everywhere, you should use model paths and you should like bind things. If you want things to be reactive to other things in like maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't, and if it does happen, multiple things might respond to it, you should use events. And if what you want to happen is like very tight coupling where one component relies on another component or like something else that's very explicit, you should call a function. So in this case, it sounds like a data binding thing. So you probably don't want to. You don't want to use the as lookup thing. Like the as lookup thing is for events and for like method calls.
Mm-hmm. Okay, got it. Okay, so let me show my screen. I have actually done some simple showcase. Okay, so I have already shared a link on the actual. Oh, I didn't. One sec. It's the mapper.
Cool.
So here is the code. I have shared it, the link on it. So what it does basically, it has. So instead of rendering the whole body, I first made it to be able to render it into a particular div, and then I extended this functionality to render first into like first pane, then into second pane, and I play with the classes, like what is the current pane, what is the next pane, and I use CSS animation to handle the proper animating the between pages. So like when you go from page to page, it does it smoothly. Cool. I don't know if it's visible on a video, but it's actually it works very smooth.
Yeah, it's a little stilted, but that's just the artifact of the video, I'm sure.
Yeah. So that's basically the idea of this library, to have kind of a mobile feeling of a native application.
Cool. So one thing you should probably be aware of is, I suspect you're not cleaning anything up between transitions in terms of like events and stuff.
But your code is automatically cleaning everything. It does when it destroys the page. It clears every byte and it clears the model completely.
Oh, okay,
so
cool.
The stuff over there is just static HTML without anything. So the old page is just it doesn't get refreshed or anything.
Got it. Cool. Are you creating like a new like page, like with a capital P for each of those panes?
No. I overrode your render function to. So yeah, I first I overridden it. I have overridden it to get an additional parameter like a container. Sure. So it works both ways. If you don't want, you can. It's just like you just drop. You just plug in this component, and you also need to add instead of a body, you need to also have a container element, which looks like this. So it's all the same. You just have a specific body element which links to the transition panes. This is a component that has these two panes and switches between them.
Got it.
And like body just renders a current namespace, and one additional element is a container element, which is kind of like the actual pane which gets rendered. So if before we were adding classes to the body itself, right? And whenever it renders the page, those classes get updated because the whole body gets replaced. Like in this case, we can't rely on having some binding inside a body because the rendering happens inside a particular div. So those bindings in a body will not work. So like I just moved the actual body classes inside of this container element. So like container element is just the thing which was a body element before, something like this.
Got it. Yeah, I was just asking because Derby does a bunch of cleanup when it like creates a new page and destroys the old page. And if you're never creating a new page, it might end up like there's certain things which will get cleaned up, but certain things which I'm not as confident will get cleaned up. So that extra mechanism helps. So you should probably just like watch out for memory leaks a little bit.
Yeah.
I could probably point you in the right direction in terms of like calling those other cleanup methods. Like an alternative method of doing this would be instead of having one page, if you created a new page somehow for like the other pane, that could let you clean up better. Exactly how to implement that, I'm not sure, but that's my initial take on it. So.
Okay, well, you have a cleaning up code somewhere, and as I looked at it, I thought that it's cleaning everything.
The page.destroy method is what like
really
really cleans things up hard. So if you're not calling that, which you're probably not, if you have one page, it will. I just haven't spent as much time debugging memory leaks within a page. There's definitely some, like it cleans up when a component is destroyed, and so that'll probably get you most of it. But there might be some stuff that's missed. So,
okay.
Anyway, like if it's not a problem, it's not a problem. But you might want to just be cognizant of memory leaks.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Well, that was also my one of the biggest things I wanted to look at while I was trying to implement this. So yeah, of course I'm going to debug it and see if it leaks or not.
Cool.
Well, currently it looks and works pretty good, but we haven't tested it in a real project yet. So probably in about 2 weeks or so I'll tell you about the actual how it works on a battlefield.
Sweet, looks cool.
Okay. So yeah, that's it. Basically, and yeah, so the stuff we do actually, I can tell you a couple of words about it.
Sure, great.
So our main project is games for students. It's kind of a so it's like it's a professor runs some game with a student, negotiation game where they negotiate with each other, try to get to some consensus with each other. So like one person is buying stuff, another one is selling stuff, and they get a couple of questions, they answer them, then they negotiate with each other, like doing some chat or video chat, whatever. So this kind of a simple games, and it works pretty good. And like Derby, I think it's a perfect solution for this kind of stuff, where you have a bunch of people sitting on the same game on the same page and interacting with each other. it performs really good.
Nice. I'm curious how complicated is your guys' like server infrastructure now? How do you have it set up?
So like I did a like third, I guess, code restructure recently. I made it a multi-application project. So currently we have each game as a separate Derby application. The server side actually is, so we have a local like router for this, and we actually do the server side functionality inside the actual application. We have a specific like so like routes are looking like this, so we can specify like actions, like a controller which is a Derby controller, a server controller which is in the same folder, and we have a server-only actions that we grab from the server controller. So this way we encapsulate the specific functionality specific for a particular game in one place.
Cool. Are you running just one front-end server now, or are you running multiple like server instances?
Currently only one is enough, and it's like we just have a cheap, I don't know, $20 DigitalOcean instance, and it works cool. Even with a lots of like we have currently, I guess, 11 games implemented on 0.6. Actually, we have an older project also working and online, and students are also playing it, which is written on 0.5, and we have another kind of games over there, which are more complicated than this one we're doing on 0.6, but we're working on porting them to the 0.6. So yeah.
Yeah, we similarly have not finished porting everything, but getting there. Our main app is all ported. It's just some of these sub things like yeah, it's like probably about I don't know, maybe 3/4 of our code is ported at this point.
Well, yeah, the same. I guess the same as with our application.
Yeah.
But it's like it's such a relief to code on 0.6. It was
good. It's supposed to be better.
Yes, it was hard to maintain lots of UI on 0.5, and we were getting like to the limits of Derby. We had lots of fors, like eaches, ifs, interviews. We have lots of components inside of components, like pretty complicated structure.
Yeah.
We have, so like this 0.6 application is actually pretty simple compared to our previous unported part of the project. So over there we had like separate subviews on a page, which we had to dynamically change. Like we had lots of those dynamic windows inside of a window and tabs and lots of this stuff which had to be changed. And so we had to play with a Derby view. We had to play with getting a name of a component from the model. Yeah, dynamically change the actual component that gets rendered in this particular section of a page. And this stuff became much more simple over here in 0.6 and much less buggy. Because we ran into bugs too often on 0.5, and it was taken maybe weeks to fix some of those. But 0.6 behaves really, really good. So it was you did a very good job, Nate.
Thanks. There's definitely still work to be done, but I think we've gotten to a point that's pretty decent.
Yeah.
So still, it's much better.
Yeah.
More work to be done.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, we should probably run pretty soon. Ian, is that it?
Yeah, let's leave on a high note.
All right, cool. Well, we'll talk next week. It's good to connect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll write all this stuff up and post it to the list and stuff. So.
Awesome.
Thanks.
All right. Okay, nice talking to you guys. Bye. See you.